This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. And this is a podcast where, since 2017, I discuss all things religion with a variety of fantastic scholars, experts, authors, and educators. On this episode, my guest is Justin Friel. Justin Friel is currently a PhD student in the joint doctoral program with the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology. His research explores how religion, culture, and politics influence and affect one another and the ways these forces shape the formation and performance of queer identities. Within that, Justin's research interests include white Christian nationalism, TikTok, popular culture, and utopia. Justin has an MA in marriage and family therapy. We talk about absolutely all of these topics in this wide-ranging conversation, and I really hope you love it. Justin is online at his website, theholyqueer.com. If you want to follow along, thank you so much for listening. Justin Friel, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
I'm delighted that you're here. Justin, I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Like you said, my name is Justin Friel. I am a religious studies PhD student in a joint program between the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology. In fact, just yesterday, I officially completed all of my coursework, which means the first step is done and now it's on to exams and all of that. But it's okay, hit the first milestone, which feels really good. Yeah, in the program, my research, I really look at and fascinated at the ways that politics, culture, and religion all intersect and shape one another, and then how that affects the formation and performance of queer identities. And lately, I've been kind of getting more focused on how that works online, in online spaces and online communities, but then also the way that works in small ways, like individual churches or denominations. So kind of looking at more of the community aspect of how our identities are shaped and formed.
I am curious about your backstory a little bit as well, because the paths that people travel in order to get involved in religion and academia as a calling or a profession, so to speak, they're always fascinating to me because the ways that people come at this work could not be more different. Can you tell me a little bit about the origin of some of your academic interests? Tell me why you came to this path in the first place.
That is a story.
I'm ready for it.
Yeah, so I grew up in rural Southwest Missouri, little town of Joplin, Missouri, and grew up very evangelical. Especially in high school is when I really started investing in evangelicalism and came to this idea of I'm called to be a pastor. And so I went to another conservative Bible college in Knoxville, Tennessee called Johnson Bible College that is now Johnson University. I was the last graduating class from Johnson Bible College before it became a university. And my experience at Johnson as a queer person is a story for another podcast. But it definitely formed this, it was really this beginning of not just understanding what a religion says or what the Bible says, but how it is constructed, the way that certain interpretation traditions or even canons of interpretation are passed on, and how that works, and how pastors are responsible for kind of like reproducing these ideas. Decided while I was there, like, I don't actually want to be a pastor. So I kind of came to this idea, like, I think I want to become a counselor and go into become a therapist. And so did my master's degree at another loosely evangelical school called Richmond Graduate University. And there I specialized in Christian sex therapy, which felt really edgy and progressive.
Mm.
But looking back on it, I'm like, oh, that was really evangelical and almost like we were trained to perpetuate elements of purity culture, but to do it in a way where it didn't seem like that's what we were doing. That was like, and then I went into clinical practice, and clinical practice is where a lot of these changes in my own experience of religion and the way that I was engaging with other people's religious experience and just their lived experience overall started to change. And I remember my supervisor at one point said, Justin, I think one of the things that really makes you a good therapist is you have a really flexible worldview, in the sense that, like, what you believe and how you look at the world, but you're also willing to say other people have different views and beliefs and ways that they're living the world. And that was this, it's this kind of slow and steady thing of like untangling from evangelicalism and escaping some of the rigidity of that tradition. So, fast forward to 2018, 2019, I start the process of coming out of the closet. And because of that, had to leave a church and another faith community that I'd been a part of, just because there just wasn't going to be compatibility or full acceptance of me as a queer person. And so left, and that was right before COVID started, which was both awful and a really unique experience of, because it's like the whole world kind of felt like it melted down in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And that was hard for, everyone. But I think one of the things that came out of it, at least for me, was it's like, when Dorothy looks behind the curtain and the wizard is just a kind of a scared man.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, that's what our entire society is.
Yeah.
Like, that's what this all is. This is all just scared people trying to project power. And that has been really damaging, especially marginalized people, whether that's queer people, people of color, people who are, in poverty, and those people who have intersecting kind of identities. And so that really accelerated my own process of forming this really critical perspective on evangelicalism and seeing and Christianity more broadly, and just kind of seeing like, oh, okay, there's some good that these things have done, but here's a lot of really bad ways. And so, and in terms of like what brought me to the PhD program, is I had kind of gotten to this point of, I was living in Tennessee at the time, and I was done living in the South. Everything from like, I hate humidity. And so being, growing up in Missouri and then living in Tennessee, it's like, I'm so over it.
Yeah.
But also just like, Tennessee just didn't feel like a place where I could be me, where I could live life the way I wanted to. And so I was looking at moving, and at the same time, the world is continuing to be turned upside down. And so many of the clients that I was working with are also dealing with like, I don't really believe this thing anymore, but I'm still living as if I do. And kind of, I found myself walking through so many people as they were deconstructing their faith. And I was like, I want to understand this better. Not only like how to help them, but then also like, how do we construct our religious identities? And so it was very much this like, I'm just curious about how all of this works and to understand it more. And so started looking and found this program that is really good. And so it's funny, like preparing for today, I was like, it was just this reminder of like, this is kind of this arc that it's like this logical progression of one kind of step to the other that is really nice to see it from this perspective, because in the midst of it, it feels like, whiplash, like I'm just bouncing back and forth. And then it's like, no, this was a gradual kind of expansion and movement.
Yeah, and the way that you've told it too is extremely linear. That all makes tons
Mm,
of sense to me. Like it doesn't sound like it's a slingshotting experience now
hmm
looking back on it and hearing you tell the story. It doesn't seem haphazard at all to me.
hmm
Yeah, and also just a quick little side note. I'm from Missouri too.
Oh
So
yeah.
I grew up in St. Louis, and so whenever
Okay.
you talk about the Missouri humidity, I'm like, oh yeah, I get that understanding. And I also have a little bit of an understanding about what that southwestern corner of the state is like. I lived in
Mm,
Columbia for 10 years, so just a little bit
okay.
north of you, but
Yeah.
that whole entire region is so religiously specific. Does that make sense?
hmm
When
hmm
people talk about Missouri, I don't think that they really understand how specifically religious and how high and like how highly dense the per capita church communities are in that southwestern Missouri region. It's so
hmm
specific in the country. It's really intense.
hmm And there's a lot of ways that Knoxville and kind of East Tennessee is the same.
Yeah.
There's this absolute density that, yeah, it's hard to not see it and to escape it because it's so dense and it's just everywhere.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of your work. I read a
Yeah.
bunch of your stuff in the last couple of weeks, which I'm really excited to hear you chat about a little bit. And so, one of the main topics that you're currently into that you sent me some work on is white Christian nationalist movements.
hmm
And I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about your reason for why
mm
these movements sort of have captured your attention and continue to hold your
mm.
attention so that you continue to feel, that it's important to write about.
For me, the you know I was drawn to white Christian nationalism through the Trump presidency and QAnon and January 6th in particular, and just being like, this is a really pervasive thing that it's like I want to understand it more. And so it was it started from there, but the more that I have studied it, and this is something I continue to see and where my research is really focusing in, is like white Christian nationalism is an existential threat to queer people. That is because, in many ways, queer people, we exist as proof that they aren't right.
Mm,
We exist as proof that there are other ways of living, other ways of thriving, other ways of having family. The white Christian nationalist imagination requires sameness and requires uniformity in a way that queerness, both like sexual queerness, but then just queer in the sense of like you're not normal, is a it's the squeaky wheel gets the grease sort of thing, but in a very much more insidious, dangerous way.
so let's talk a little bit about some of the main terminology here, real quick, just to
Mhm.
like classify some stuff. I'm always curious to hear about the distinctions between like what goes into this term. So we have people who
Mm,
identify as Christian, we have
mhm,
white Christian communities, we have
mhm,
nationalists that don't
mhm,
really, concern themselves with religion a whole heck of a lot. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about teasing out these terms a little bit and what
mm.
white Christian nationalist is and how that differentiates from something just like a normal nationalist.
When I think of nationalism, I think of this kind of imagined category or this hopeful fantasy of creating a country, or sometimes it's not quite like a state or a country, but it's more like society. It's about creating that for a certain kind of people. We see this play out. There is Jewish nationalism, there is Hindu nationalism. There are so many nationalistic movements, and there always have been, and there likely always will be. And so, like, that's like, okay, that's a thing that just happens. It's like nationalism happens, and it's maybe not always the best thing. But when we get into religious nationalism, is when I think we start to see a lot more of kind of the dangers of these types of movements, because it's not just then about, most nationalisms have racial components to it, and sometimes that racial component is marked and obvious, and other times it's more kind of hidden and subversive. And I think Christian nationalism is, it borders on that, of like kind of the overt like race aspects and the more core covert parts. When it gets into, Christian nationalism, this isn't a country just for a certain type of people, but it's for a certain type of belief, a
Mm.
certain type of practice, a certain aesthetic. And that then, it's not, as we kind of continue to delve down, it's like, okay, it's a certain type of Christian. And it kind of keeps going down. And so then there's almost this like an hourglass of like, it goes down to like, this is the exact right type of person that is the ideal. And then society is for that person. And the country is for that person. Or that group of people. And then everyone else is this kind of, you can be a citizen, but you're not going to have as many privileges or as many rights. Where this gets really difficult, I was in a course at the beginning of this last year on religious nationalism. We mainly looked at Hindu nationalism and white Christian nationalism. And one of the things that's really hard about this is to differentiate, okay, can you be a Christian and not a white Christian nationalist? And the answer is yes. Like that is definitely possible. But the way that I take some of my research is, I think there's a lot of Christians who, when they talk about Christian nationalism, they are like, well, that's not real Christianity.
Mm.
There's I'm not a Christian like them. And it's like, okay, that is a factually true statement.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is it prevents us from actually interrogating what it is about that tradition that gave rise to this. Like, what is it about evangelical Christianity that led to Christian nationalism? And that's where I think a lot of the fruitful research is like, okay, how do we interrogate the tradition itself in a way that doesn't lump all Christians into evangelicalism or all evangelicals into white Christian nationalism, but says, okay, you're adjacent to it. You're part of the same tradition. And, the work of Philip Gorski and Sam Perry and Whitehead, they all do a really good job of kind of showing some of the differentiation that Christian nationalism is almost like a spectrum of, you have your diehard adherents, like those that showed up on January 6th. And then you have those that are almost the opposite end, those who are, adamantly opposed to all things nationalism or maybe even all things Christianity. But then you have these middle grounds of plenty of people who espouse and perpetuate the theological underpinnings of white Christian nationalism, but they don't, take the step to say, okay, well, we should seize the levers of power. Some of my work is showing like, okay, this, a few like pastors or Christian thinkers I've kind of profiled, it's like their work is laying the foundation. It is the intellectual fuel for elements of these movements, and that's why we need to pay attention to them. Is this author over here or thinker isn't saying we should have a January 6th and have a Christian theocracy, but they're talking about some theological issues that lead to that are fueling it. And so I think that's the long answer to like Christianity and nationalism and white Christian nationalism and all of that, the way that it is a complicated mess.
Well, and one of the things that you said to me just a little bit ago is kind of sticking in my mind, where you talked about the existential threat. And every day right now, you can, open up your news apps or newspapers or whatever, and you can find some new piece of legislation that is being discussed or proposed or passing in the country that is very anti-queer. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of give me an overview about what you're seeing with regards to anti-queer bills and legislation that's being introduced. What is successfully passing? What's happening generally in the States right now?
It's a mess. I mean, I don't have my notes right in front of me, but it's something like, according to the ACLU, I think 694 bills were introduced across the United States, and 63 of them passed. And even in like Colorado, which is solidly blue, across all levels of our legislature and our government. A couple of, I think, banning transgender women from sports was introduced, and I don't even think it didn't even get out of committee. And there's another one. So some of these are being introduced in states where there is no possibility that it's going to pass. Like I think even in California, some were introduced. But then you have states like Tennessee, Texas, Florida, on, where they're introducing them and they're passing. And it is a terrifying thing to watch as someone who grew up 36. So I was alive during AIDS and the height of the AIDS crisis and the culture wars, and seeing kind of this shift, especially during like the Obama presidency of like, oh, we are making advances legislatively. We have protections. And then to see that all, not all of it, but to see a lot of it unwind really, really quickly has been really scary to watch. And especially since so many of these bills, you can tell like these are all the same bills. Where are they coming from? And it's these, conservative think tanks and really radical organizations that are drafting this model legislation and then sending it out, and it's being voted on very, very quickly. But one of the things that we are seeing that is really interesting to me is, as far as I know, we haven't really seen any bills that are targeting gay marriage or really other aspects of queerness. We do have Justice Thomas last year in the Dobbs decision kind of alluded to like, oh, maybe we should look at Obergefell and Lawrence v. Texas, Obergefell for marriage equality, and Lawrence v. Texas, which overturned all anti-sodomy laws. Maybe we should look at those again. And like that was a shock to the system of like, oh, this is, even these bedrock things are potentially up for debate. But where we are seeing it is with transgender issues. The vast majority of these are about transgender issues. And I would even say the Tennessee law that attempted to essentially ban drag, except for from bars, was also about gender. The affront to drag queens and drag kings is also about gender. It's about, they are violating the rules about gender, the binaries. And same thing with trans people, it's this violation of what is seen as natural, as like male and female, and about reproduction and all of these things, because of the way that it challenges the gender binaries and the ideas of sexuality that are so closely held to evangelicalism and white Christian nationalism. And so, and then you're also seeing this ploy of like, oh, we're protecting the children, and where that we're protecting the children was a so blatantly just bold-faced lie. It was in Tennessee, where, we have the school shooting at the Covenant School. And instead of the legislature doing anything about that, they are saying, oh, we're here to protect kids, so we're banning transgender healthcare in the state. And it's like, how many kids have died from transgender healthcare in the state of Tennessee? Oh, 0? Okay. How many have died from gun violence? Oh, that many? It's like, it's just showing that they don't care about the children. They care about the right kinds of children. And they use the child as a way to say, oh, here's this awful thing, and so we have to protect the child and do these things.
Yeah, the whole the protecting the children thing, while year after year children die in our nation's public schools, is pretty surreal to wrap your brain around, and very troubling as well. Because if you can't protect kids who are actually already here, then we've got such a bigger problem on our hands, and attacking other things is just a distraction from having no plan to actually address something that's an epidemic right in front of our very eyes.
Yeah, it's not even that it's a plan. It's they just don't have the motivation, the desire, which I think makes it even worse. Like, if it's, here's a problem, we don't know how to fix it. Okay, I can get on board with you saying that.
Right.
I can't get on board with, one of the representatives from Tennessee being like, well, the government just can't do anything about it. And what we need is revival.
Well, there's some other stuff that you've written in this area
Yeah.
as well. You sent me something that I really enjoyed reading, which is called "What Do White Christian Nationalism and the New Apostolic Reformation Have to Do with the Target Boycott? Everything." And I really love this piece because the boycotts and like the brand issues that have been going on the last several months, especially with like Bud Light as well, is another huge one that people will probably know about. I wonder if you can tell me what's going on with like these boycotts and what you were thinking with regard to this piece. I thought it was a delight to read it.
So I had a lot of fun with that one because it's just so ridiculous to me. Like, these are grown-ass adults throwing temper tantrums because there's Pride merchandise in Target.
Dylan Mulvaney?
Yes, Dylan Mulvaney. Drank a can of Bud Light and is trans. It kind of goes back to the gun thing where it's like, this is what y'all are upset about. And the thing is, like, there's definitely some, like, I don't know if it's quite Schadenfreude to like be like, oh, look at these like adults having tantrums. But I think that this is one of the things that I wanted to do in that piece is like, okay, yeah, this is silly. But to say, like, if that's where the reporting on this ends, then we are actually culpable for these things continuing if we aren't digging into the deeper levels of it, right? It's sort of like, this is kind of back to some of the white Christian nationalism stuff real quick, but the January 6th Commission report doesn't mention Christianity, white Christian nationalism, the New Apostolic Reformation, doesn't address or mention any of that, even though there was testimony given about how these movements were a key part of January 6th. And it was left out of the report because they didn't want to offend Christians. And it's like, okay, I get that impulse, but not talking about white Christian nationalism and January 6th is like investigating a house that burned down from arson and just ignoring the fact that there was a can of gasoline at the scene. Like, it is the exact same negligence. And it's the same negligence that I think is playing out with Target is like, some of this is like, okay, well, white suburbia doesn't really have a town square. And so Target and Chick-fil-A, like, there's these places where we have to protest and there's no public place for that. So we'll do it in the Target store. But I think what it is a lot of it goes back to aesthetics for me. I think that that's one of the key things here, which coincidentally enough is, aesthetics is a really key part of most authoritarian or fascist movements. They pay a lot of attention to them. With this, there's this one pastor that I track. His name is Parker Green. He had this YouTube video where I don't know if he realized what he was saying, but he basically said, this isn't about someone who is in a gay marriage that's just like a straight marriage and you say hi to them on the street, and then goes on to like talk about how if you're not a Christian, like, that's okay. But it's this like, oh, so it's that it was in public, that this isn't happening in a private way. And so I think that that's part of this is like, if we look at the New Apostolic Reformation talks about this kind of, they have these almost two pillars is one of the ways that I think about it. One is a reform of the church along this really strict system of hierarchies that is organized under a reclamation of the 5 offices, which are from the New Testament, and they're the offices of apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher. The idea is that, these 5 offices are how the church is supposed to be governed. And this is from God. This is God's plan. And so we are reforming the church to be in alignment to it. Like, okay, that's the church. But then there's this other half of it, which is where it gets into like dominionism or dominion theology, and the 7 mountains are part of this too, where it's like, okay, well, we brought the church into alignment with God's plan. And so then we also have to bring society into alignment with God's plan. And that is achieved through, they have the seven mountains, which are like education and politics and the economy, these kind of social spheres almost. And their idea is like a Christian or an appointed, anointed person who is kind of doing the work of God, even if they're not a Christian, is in control of that. And if we control the seven mountains, if we have control over the society, we can bring it into alignment with what God wants. I think a lot of churches, a lot of Christians would maybe kind of say similar things or somewhat agree or not along to some of that. But with where the New Apostolic Reformation takes it is there's also this intense focus on spiritual warfare and demons and strongholds. And because the New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR, is very much has arisen from charismatic and Pentecostal and holiness kind of traditions, and takes this idea of spiritual warfare, and then because their reformation of the church and society are God's plan, anything that stands against them is against God. And who's against God? Demons, Satan. Mm. And so it becomes not only an us versus them, but it's a cosmic us versus them, which is why Parker's wife, Bessie, on one of the Instagram posts that she put about the what was happening in Target, had in all caps, "This is all demonic." And it was in reference to the ABC Deconstructing Gender book that was like a kid's book about kids who don't fit into, the artificial binaries. And it's like, cool. It's a really cute book, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, what's demonic about this? And it's like, nothing. It just is a different way of being. But because everything is so wrapped up in this idea that we have is how everything has to be, everything outside of that is evil. And that's what is fueling a lot of this. It's the fact that I think in some ways, like a lot of people in the NAR or white Christian nationalists, they don't actually care about trans people. They don't care, like, how many of them didn't know what a drag queen was until this became a thing 2 years ago?
Yeah.
It's this, that it's in person, that this trans woman is drinking Bud Light. That's what I drink. What? It's this, you're shopping in the same store as me, and the store is like featuring things that have pride, and like that's offensive to me. How dare that? How dare there be anything that challenges my idea of how things should be? And that's like how this gets, so wrapped up. And it's what, same thing with Bud Light, with Target, and most recently, like there's calls for a ban on Chick-fil-A because someone found that Chick-fil-A has a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, what was another one recent? Oh, Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel has fallen. There was this whole like meme discourse of people writing these they were like letters home from the front, and it was like, "Dear Janice, we have to retreat because Cracker Barrel has fallen." And like, it's because Cracker Barrel was like, "Hey, we're okay with gay people." It's like those sorts of things where it's like, hey y'all, it's the fried okra and the chicken and dumplings are gonna taste the exact same. And like, it's not like Cracker Barrel is gonna start having drag shows. Like, it's still gonna be a pretty white heterosexual space. But yeah, it's this like, things aren't looking the way I think they should look. I have to navigate other points of view and other ways of living in my life, and that's really inconvenient. And it feels scary because it's against my perception of God. Well, it must be Satan.
Yeah, we're going through such an interesting time as a nation right now. We always are. Like, whenever people say, "Oh, these times are so special," it's always like this. But sometimes it just feels, it can whenever it's very personal, it intensifies. I'm loving your work on this field. I thought that this is such a cool article. You have another article as well, "Nuancing the Queer: Exploration of the Queer as other within Christian nationalism. And you've kind of already
Mhm.
touched upon this topic a bit, but you write about a moment where you were saying that you were surprised that certain acts of violence had not occurred,
Mhm.
and then one does in Colorado
Mhm.
Springs at Club Q. And this is
Mhm.
a really interesting detail for me because as a classroom teacher several years ago with seniors during the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in Florida, my
Mm.
own high school seniors told me to my face, "We're surprised it hasn't happened here yet." Like
Mhm.
about a shooting in their own school.
Mhm.
So that line in your article
Mhm.
about being surprised about certain acts of violence not occurring more often is
Mhm.
an experience that really resonated with me as a teacher of high school students who live in this
Mhm.
era of school shootings, which we kind of alluded to earlier. But I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that article as well and how it feels to watch your work become more prescient, like in real time as you're writing it.
That article I had been working on kind of all the course I was in on religious nationalism, and was when I was really starting to figure out, okay, I setting aside the religious belief about the sins of being queer, like setting that aside, what is it about queer people that these movements are so obsessed with, that are so focused on?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's where I started to kind of develop this, like, okay, it's because we stand in opposition. We are out of line. And, that was, so that was 2022, which is when we started to see the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers show up at Pride events. It was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, that a U-Haul truck full of armed militia members was pulled over on their way to a Pride festival. So these things were happening, and it was around the same time, I think, where the power substations were attacked, and was kind of this. It also happened to be that there was a drag show that was supposed to be performed, and the drag show got canceled because there was no power. And so it's like we started to see this inflection of violence. It's an implied violence. It's not a active we are harming people, but we are kind of showing like it's a threat. It's a you better shape up, or we're going to start using the guns that we have. Is kind of this implied thing. And fast forward to November, I'm sitting at a table at the American Academy of Religion conference, and we're talking about what our interest in academia is, and specifically more public facing work. And that's where I told people, I'm in this because queer people are under threat, and we don't have time for the ideas of the academy to slowly trickle down into the culture. Like, we just don't have time for that. And so I want to be kind of a foot in academia, one foot in the public, so that I can help queer people survive and can help make the world safer for us, which makes the world safer for everyone. And was talking about that. And that night is when the Club Q shooting happened. That was a difficult weekend, because I was like, it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened an hour away from me. And that is, I joke with people, I was like, if I could study anything else, I would.
Yeah.
I would be thrilled if, like, tomorrow we magically wake up and there's no more like racism or right Christian nationalism or anything. I'm like, oh, I'll study something really cool, like
Right.
weird mysticism, like
Yeah.
just fun. And it's like, no, instead I have to like be on, Truth Social and Twitter, and track people on Instagram, and really watch some really awful things. Oddly enough, one of the things that actually gives me comfort sometimes is the book The Giver. It's this utopic society where there's no pain, because one person is responsible for kind of holding all of the painful memories for the people.
Mm.
And there's this way that I'm like, I think sometimes that's our job as academics and as researchers, is it's our job to look at these things so that other people don't, so that we can protect people from it. And I think that people should be watching these things and should be aware of it. But it's this, okay, I can do this. I have the capacity and the interest to focus on these things. And there's also this humor to it sometimes of like, oh, I'm one of the articles I say about Target I wrote for a class, and I was like, okay, what's going to be like my topic, or what's my lead? And then like Target happens. I'm like, oh, there it is.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't have to wait long for there to be a topic for me to write an essay
Yeah.
on, which is like kind of exhausting, but it's like, well, I'll never run out of material.
Oh, I love you just mentioned some of your social media habits, as well as the concept of a utopian society, because
Mm.
I know that you're interested in those as well.
Hmm.
And, I'm just curious if you can tell me a little bit more about your social media routines, maybe some good and some bad, because like you've written about some good stuff as well, too, for like
Hmm.
how it's like good for queer communities. So
Hmm.
I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about some of your routines and maybe some goods and bads that you found with social media in regards to your own work.
I was in a colleague asked me a similar question, like, so I was presenting in class about like digital ethnography and the ways that, in particular, I was presenting on the like digital lives of Muslim women, specifically queer Muslim women, and was saying like, and that's true of like, yeah, there's a way that this research allows us to kind of look in on the lives of people that like I can't, because I'm a white American man. I can't go up to a queer Muslim woman, especially one who's wears the hijab or something, and ask her about her queerness and her faith. Like I can't. I don't have that type of social connection, but I can watch her TikToks, her Instagram posts, and get a sense for this. So I think that's one aspect of it. But they were asking like, oh well, how do you research? And I'm like, sometimes it's, Googling or not Googling, like putting things into the search bar of TikTok and seeing what comes up. And that's mainly if I'm doing kind of intentional research about a topic. But really, the way that I study TikTok is I just use it. And I do have a research account that I use, particularly if I'm wanting to research like Christian nationalism stuff on TikTok, because I don't want that on my regular feed. I want it to be, segregated away. Um,
Yeah.
but but part of it, and I realized like part of that is just like the it's just easier to like I just use TikTok, so I might as well study it, is like kind of how I started on it. But there's one of the theorists that I do a lot of work with is the late Jose Munoz, and he in his book Cruising Utopia talks about the idea of ephemera as part of it is like ephemera is the historical record of queerness, but it's always kind of hidden because queerness is so often had to be hidden and has been censored. And he then goes on to say like these ephemeral traces, like an example is one really powerful example is he talks about the riot that broke out after the after Matthew Shepard's murder in New York, and he talks about like this ephemeral memory of this thing and what it means, and but it's also this way he says like they give us a taste of what could be, and there's a way that TikTok because of the algorithm, because of the infrastructure of the app itself, is incredibly ephemeral. Like if you're on the For You page and you reset it in the middle of a video, there's no way for you to find that video again. It is like gone. So there's this like they're temporary. There's this way that it's like trying to hold water in your hand. It's going to run out, and I think that that's a really powerful thing about TikTok. So I just kind of like use it, and I mean same thing with like when I write about like some of the media work that I do for TV shows. It's like I wrote a paper on Midnight Mass my first year, the Netflix series, because I was watching it. I'm like, oh, this is cool. So it's like I stumble upon these cool things that I want to
Yeah.
talk about and that are really good examples of like, oh, here's this thing that I'm reading this book by Jose Munoz, and then I'm scrolling TikTok, and I'm like, oh, this is an example of that. So there's that that really joyful of like kind of stumbling into these cool things.
Amazing. Well, I want to know a little bit more about your thoughts on the cohort for Sacred Rights,
Yeah.
the Carpenter Foundation cohort focused on gender and
Mhm.
sexuality. Tell me a little bit about how your experience has been so far about boosting your skills for public scholarship and engagement for the benefit of the wider society.
Yeah, it it has been so much fun. Um, I and I mean, I very much came into the cohort and the whole program really, really surprised that I got in, because my dissertation advisor, who's Dr. Deepa Sundaram, is a sacred rights trainer in a different cohort, and so she was very pushing, like, Justin, you need to apply for this. You need to apply. It would be great for you. And I ended up doing it, and she told me, like, hey, Justin, I'm just going to let you know there were like 120 some odd applicants for the 12 spots for my cohort.
Mm.
And when she told me that, I was like, okay, there's no way a second year student is going to get this. And then I ended up getting it, and I was like, oh, this is great. And learned afterwards that they really tried to build in a mixture of people at different stages of their career. So I think I was at the earliest stage. I mean, I think we had two people defend their dissertation during our cohort, and we have one tenured professor that was in the cohort. So it's like, it was this way of like, yeah, I am not as experienced as them. And that is just the simple fact of I'm 2 years into my program. But there was it was such an honor to be able to listen to some of these folks who are doing really incredible work and have this history of doing this work, and I get to like talk to them about this like essay that I'm writing. Is this really cool opportunity? But it was also just this, it was so affirming of, because so many of us, even like tenure track professors, were like struggling with calling themselves an expert, and the imposter syndrome of pitching something to be published.
Yeah.
And it was just this like, okay, good. Like, I'm not the only one that is terrified about this, And so it's just this affirmation of like, hey, you're doing good work and you can learn. And here are some ways, here are some tools that you can use to make your work better. And I can already tell from the things that I've written this quarter, like, wow, this is better. Like because I spent so many weeks focusing on how to write and how to bring in ideas, and when to cite and when to stand on your own thoughts. And it has been immeasurably beneficial to me.
Amazing. What are some of the risks and rewards and responsibilities for you personally? I know that that's a big conversation point within the cohort.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your personal reflections on those three terms.
That's hard. This is where I kind of go like, oh, I wish I didn't have to study white Christian nationalism, because like one of my best friends in my program studies queerness and mysticism. And I'm like, I don't think they're going to get death threats.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just don't think their work is going to land in front of anyone who would think to, do that. And I'm very glad for them. But for me, it is something that I'm like, especially since like I have a piece that is hopefully going to go for publication soon. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to be searchable online as someone who says these things and has these positions. And the American Academy of Religion, our big yearly conference, is in Texas this year. Which there's this other part of it of like, yeah, there is a potential that violence could happen. And it's a sobering fact. But at, like the good millennial who lived through 9/11 and George Bush saying like, If we don't continue our life, we let the terrorists win. And like, we can unpack that and all the mess of that statement another time, but it's like, I'm not going to be intimidated. And some of that is, I spent 30 years of my life being scared as a Christian that my sexuality was going to get found out. And so I'm like, I'm not going to do that anymore, and granted, I'm still going to manage those risks. Like, the Sacred Rights program paid for us to be able to have a year of Delete Me, that this company that basically scrubs as much of you off the internet as possible, so that it makes it safer for you to be there. But it's the only reason I'm willing to take these risks is because of the rewards. It goes back to queer people are facing an existential threat, and in the same way that the generation that started ACT UP to fight against the silence of AIDS in the 80s, we have to do the same thing now. Like, no one's going to protect us but ourselves, and the way that I can protect myself and my community is to talk about these things, to raise them as issues, to point out what they are doing and where they are weak, and to then also offer, okay, here are these other ways we can live, and that's what excites me. Is like, okay, how can I show people that there's other ways to live, and how can that change their life? How can that change, be a very small part of changing society towards something that is much more liberative and safe and wholesome for everyone?
Fantastic. Well, Justin Friel, where can people find you if they want to know more about your work and follow along in the future?
Yeah, so I am still on Twitter for now. And that handle is JT Friel, so JT Friel. So yeah, my website, I have my personal website, which is The Holy Queer, which is kind of a larger project, but that is the kind of my internet home for a lot of my work. And one of my summer projects is to start putting a lot more content on there and kind of build it out. But that's a space to watch for future information.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. I have loved reading your work the last couple of weeks and learning about all of your different projects. And it's been such a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.